Welcome to First Block, a Notion series where founders and executives from the world's leading companies tell us what it was like to navigate the many firsts of their startup journey and what they learned from that experience. I am Akshay Kothari, Notion's co-founder and COO. Today, our guest is Parker Conrad, co-founder and CEO of Rippling. Rippling lets you easily manage your employees' payroll, benefits, expenses, devices, apps, and more, all in one place.
Great to meet you.
Great to see you. Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for doing this for us. I think our audience is very excited to hear from you today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I think maybe a good place to start would be just like the beginning. I think we'd love to hear, I think one thing you said in a recent interview, you sort of said people should not start a company. Why is that? What's the biggest misconception about starting a company that you think most people don't see?
So I started, I feel like I've done 3 startups, and I felt like my first one I did because I was naive and had no idea what I was getting into, which I think is true for most people. And the next 2, I felt like I had literally no other options. And if I had like really any other option, I probably wouldn't have done it. And I think what's hard about it is there's so many things that are like very sort of like soul sucking and people talk about. And most of the time it doesn't work out and you fail. And I think sometimes that's kind of glamorized that, you fail, but like you get up, you keep going, you learn so much from your failures. And I've actually, I have found that I don't think I've learned a lot from things that haven't worked out, and except how much it sucks. And there's just enormous, personal cost to those failures. It destroys relationships. It's psychologically, I think, really, really painful. Impacts your health. I started my first company with one of my roommates from college. And the sort of slow grinding failure really destroyed that relationship. When I eventually left, he was a groomsman in my wedding, and then I got fired the week between my wedding and my honeymoon. It was super awkward, from, after this sort of long process and long falling out. And so most of these experiences have just not been sort of super positive in terms, and I think everyone sort of thinks that they will be, and that's why my advice is always don't do it. Now that advice it never really sticks because people, I tell people don't do it, it's a mistake, and that only seems to re-energize people, and make it's sort of almost like a challenge, you're not tough enough for it or something like that. But I genuinely mean it, that I think the opportunities are much better, if you can be sort of an executive at a company or an early employee at a company that does well, or just even play a critical role. The financial upside makes a lot more sense. It's not quite as large, but you can pick companies where the probability and the odds of success are much higher. And I think just everything else about it is much healthier and more positive from a lifestyle perspective. But obviously Rippling seems to be working out so far, and I'm sort of super grateful for that. And it's an enormous amount of fun as well when it's working.
So maybe take us a few years ago. I guess you've done 2 startups before, you feel this way, but you do go ahead and start Rippling again.
Yeah.
So what was going through your head? It feels like for you, was that just the last option and you had to do it, or?
Yeah, I had, there was, as you know, and probably most people know, there was just this really explosive ending to my, at my last company where, I was forced out of the company by Andreessen Horowitz and David Sachs, who was my then COO, as part of that. And I sort of realized, man, there was this thing that I thought Zenefits was going to become, even if I wasn't there to see it through, that was clearly not going to happen. And so, I felt like I didn't really have any other options. I felt like there was this enormous opportunity that, I sort of understood the market. I knew exactly what people wanted. And like I talked to my co-founder Prasanna and said, look, there's $100 billion like sitting right there in the street, and no one else can see it except for us. And all we have to do is like walk over and like pick it up. And so that was why, I felt like I didn't really have sort of other options. Like it was like everything was like pointing me at this like one particular thing. But yes, I desperately wanted to like not, do that again. So my like sincere hope is that, I don't, like if I do another company after Rippling, like something's gone like very wrong. Like hopefully that doesn't, I'm not in that position again.
Can you talk a little bit about your early conversation with Prasanna? Like how, it sounds like you all started Zenefits together and then also did Rippling together. What was?
Rippling was an extension or an evolution, I think, of what we tried to do at my last company. He was a little bit surprised, like, why do you want to do something like in the same area or in a similar area? And that was sort of why that I was like, look, fundamentally, like as a product, like Zenefits, like the concept was correct. It's why it grew as quickly as it did. It sort of like came apart for a bunch of reasons that really had nothing to do with like the core idea. Sort of product like thesis, that were about, sort of weird investor stuff and, internal conflict and like, and obviously like, a bunch of sort of internal issues as well. But like fundamentally it was like, look, like this is a recipe that's going to work.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe the fundraising process this time around, third time around? And I'm really excited to go deeper into the product stuff, especially around like all the different things that you've built today, but where you started. But maybe before we go there, let's talk a little bit about fundraising. How was it different doing it the third time?
Actually, so Mike Vernal, who ended up leading around from Sequoia at our Series C, who's a close friend that I have enormous respect for and is really incredible. Mike sort of was, or Sequoia was talking to us about sort of each of our rounds from seed all the way up until when they eventually invested. And in our seed round, I remember Mike told me, he said, look, the partnership's view is that there's one reason to do this round and there's one reason not to do this round, and they're both the same reason, which was like my involvement in the company. And so I think that was generally the sort of dynamic, sort of spoken or unspoken. There were most of the seed investors in my last company, like almost all of them ended up like just immediately putting money into Rippling, including like most of the folks in sort of the broader YC network. And so like Y Combinator was just an enormous supporter of mine. And I think it would have been a lot harder for me, like, had, PG and Sam Altman and Gary Tan and sort of all of the other folks not sort of really like circled the wagons and said, no, like we sort of like understand like what happened here and we're like very much on Team Parker. And so I'm like enormously grateful to them for doing that. And so like the fundraising was like, weirdly, it was like very easy, but very bifurcated. It wasn't challenging to raise. At the seed round, we ended up raising a very substantial seed finance. We raised about $17 million in seed financing, right around the time that we did YC. And obviously there were some people that were like, no way. And so I remember like, for example, when we did our Series A, it was again like very controversial. We had, we again like, were fortunate that there were a lot of investors that really wanted to put money in, and we had a lot of term sheets and had great investors in Kleiner Perkins. but also there were a bunch of firms that pulled out of the process.
So I think connecting this back to, I think where you started, which is like, people shouldn't start companies. I sort of wonder, like, if you hadn't started Rippling, would that mean we're just using these like really old school products? Does the world require this naivete or almost like ignorance to drive this like creative destruction in some ways? Because it seems like even for you, I think there's hundreds of reasons for not to do it again. But in some ways, like the startup world is probably grateful that you built good software into this world.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far, but like, but yeah, I think that like, I do think that I started Rippling in part because there was this sort of thing that I wanted to exist, and like, it was very clear that it was not going to, like, Zenovus wasn't going to do it. Like Gusto was, sort of not moving in that direction. Like there were just no other companies that were sort of felt like there was this like hole that like we could plug, very, very uniquely. And that part of it is like fun and exciting.
Yeah.
I enjoy that. And I don't want to make it sound like, man, it's like, ugh, like, life sucks. Like I really enjoy like the work that I do, and I love the people that I work with at Rippling, and I really enjoy the product that we're building. And so it is a lot of fun as well. But I think you're right that like, I think there are a lot of people that start companies like because they're naive about like what they're facing. And I think some of that, I think that's true both on the product side, that sometimes people start companies and you often get people that are new to markets that start the most successful companies, because the people that are new to the market like are just like too uninformed about all the reasons why it won't work. Like they just don't know all of the reasons why this isn't possible. And the people who have like worked in industries for long periods of time like often end up not being the sort of real like source of innovation.
Yeah.
Because like they already sort of take for granted, all of the things, all of the reasons why this would never ever work. And so, like I think you see that again and again. And so, yeah, I think it probably is required, but like, man, I think that it ends up chewing up and spitting out a lot of people.
All right, let's talk about compound startup. I love this phrase. I guess I kind of understand. So today, Rippling is the suite of products, right? Like I think there's a cloud for 3 different functions. And it seems like, at least from what you've said, like you probably had this vision even back then, especially as you think about the people graph. So how did you break down to like where to start, like which product to first build, and then how does this all come together? And how did you think about doing something simple versus like actually building the suite together?
So we started with 3 things. We started with HRIS and payroll, which is maybe a couple things like, already right in there. Identity, so what people would call, single sign-on, IAM, that sort of stuff. And then lastly, device management for, computers, laptops, things like that. And the reason we did that is we started off really looking at onboarding checklists for companies. Like what were the things that most companies had these sort of documents that they would maintain, perhaps in Notion or, in other systems, like all the things that needed to happen when you hired a new employee. Yeah. And I viewed that as like these were roadmaps or that sort of identified all of the hidden places that where information about employees was located within your company. Like these were all, because by definition, when you added a new employee, there were places that needed to know about that employee or systems or, and that became your onboarding checklist for a business. And so this idea of like unifying employee data across the business started with, those checklists. And we thought that sort of like app access and single sign-on, device management, and then sort of all of the sort of core HRS and payroll stuff, that was like the clearest way to cover like 80% of those checklists for a lot of companies. And so that was how we started.
Can you talk a little bit about device management? Like, did you all debate maybe just starting with HR only versus this idea of app access and device management being part of it? Because when I remember when Rippling came out, I think it was sort of interesting that you sort of also had HR and IT. And it seemed like it was by design you wanted that to be the starting point.
Yeah, so I think that like, and so this is like one of the things that I talk about when I talk about compound startups, is that one of the problems with sort of the kind of conventional wisdom about point SaaS of like building, individual applications that are extremely narrow, is that from a market perspective, a lot of that's picked over, and so I think a lot of companies have ended up occupying local minima. And so now, like any sort of point SaaS application that you can think of, there are 3 or 4 people like in that market, fighting over that market. And now, like there are these sort of global minima that are kind of harder to get to, but that I absolutely think that the best product is actually the compound product. It's where things are sort of deeply integrated, fully interoperable, take advantage of like some really deep investments in platform capabilities that can be shared across applications. The question was almost like, how do we like skate to where the puck is going, or kind of like, figure out like leapfrog the roadmaps for a lot of competitors to kind of get ahead of where people are headed. And that's a lot of like, I think from a product perspective, I think that's a very important thing to do. And it's something that we try and do today, is think about, when we build things, not like how do we build things that kind of like, get us to parity. Like there are places in Rippling where we believe that we have product gaps. And sort of when we try and build that, instead of like, okay, we can close that gap, it's like, how do we take maybe sometimes even a little more time and really smash it with a sledgehammer and turn it from like a gap to something where we just like beat and destroy like every company in the market on that thing that was previously like a weakness of ours. So like a great example of this is like global. 2 years ago at Rippling, when we looked at sort of what were the major reasons that we would lose with sort of much larger companies, one of the biggest reasons was global, that companies would say, we need more global capabilities, and they would look at systems that had usually some very lightweight global capabilities. They had maybe some localized types, a few sort of like custom fields by country that they would track, and that was it. And we said like, no, we're gonna like really fully globalize all of Rippling. We're gonna have, a fully global HRIS, but that also means, local, like local policies for overtime in our time tracking system, local courses in local languages that are locally compliant for anti-harassment training country by country, like rules for PTO, for parental leave, for like all these things, like in every country, every province, every jurisdiction, for like 50 countries around the globe. But then also like, local ben admin software, so you can enroll in, benefits in Canada and the UK and Australia and, Europe, wherever you are. And then the sort of real like pièce de résistance was true global payroll, and global what's called EOR, which is for people that don't have their own entities in these countries. And Rippling's actually was the first and really still the only company that's built like a single global payroll system. And so Rippling's like the first company where like literally you can have a single pay run, you can have some employees are like in the US, in the UK, in India, in Canada, in France, in Australia, and like I think there's like 20 different countries now that we support, and you hit run once, and like immediately taxes are calculated, net pay is there, you hit go, and like it's on its way.
Are you still the single administrator for all of Rippling?
I am.
Like you're still pressing the run button?
Absolutely, and I keep taking on like new responsibilities there. So I run payroll for we have now over 2,000 employees in about a dozen different countries. I run payroll for all of them. I manage benefits. So like I kicked off open enrollment for our company in the US, in Canada, just earlier this week, I think yesterday actually. I also approve expenses for the entire company, everything over $10. We have an expense management system, so it's not like it's not only that I'm crazy, but it forces me to sort of really use the spend management system. So in our finance cloud issues, corporate cards, expense reimbursements, bill pay, so we just switched over to our own bill pay system. So that means I manage all all the bill payments as well. The challenge, one of the things I think that's like great as a client, and is that at Rippling there's this constant product effort to make that work, and so it requires the product and engineering team to like systematically like compress the amount of like work required to do all this stuff using Rippling. And it has to get like lower and lower and lower over time as our organization gets bigger and more complex, and we start adding in new products for me to continue to be able to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see, we were talking about this earlier, but we look at, you can look at companies on LinkedIn, really any business between up to 2,000 employees. And at any stage of growth, the companies that use Rippling consistently have half the headcount in HR, IT, and finance as businesses that really use any other system. A 25-person company, might have like on average, I think it's like, 1.6 people in those functions if they're not on Rippling, and it's like 0.8 people on average if they're on Rippling. And at 1,000 employees, you have an average of I think it's 42 people in those functions. We exclude recruiting, but like all other, 42 people in those functions if you're on any system other than Rippling, and 26 on average if you're in Rippling. And I think it's because of like the way I use the product that happens, because we're constantly making it easier and easier and easier to do this stuff.
Yeah, I love both the concepts of just this idea that a few different systems are coming together into like the global minima. I think that's a great idea for people to think about. I feel like a lot of the companies sort of build toasters, like, one-off like use case for SaaS, and I think it sort of gets you to just like spiral down to the lowest cost or something. Whereas in your particular case, even if each one of the pillars might have some product gaps, it seems like the fact that you have all those three together allows you to do things that you can't even imagine doing in other systems.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing, like, everyone always wants to believe, or you were inclined to believe because it's like so ingrained, that if you do it in this way, it means the product's like less good or less complete. I really don't think that that's the case. And the reason is that, when we spend a lot of time thinking across product categories and verticals, and when you do that, you start to notice a lot of repeated patterns. And so you end up being able to build software in this different way, where Rippling's architecture is that we have this data layer on the bottom, which we call the employee graph. And then we have this layer that's our platform layer that we sometimes refer to as middleware, but it's basically capabilities. It's things like reporting and analytics, role-based permissions, workflows, approvals, custom policies. Like, there are a whole bunch of other things in there now at this point. And then on top of that, you build these applications. And what you find is like so many of the things that people end up viewing as, what's the long tail? What are the enterprise features? What are the things we really need as we grow? It ends up being a very similar set of things across seemingly very disparate verticals. And so at Rippling, we're constantly trying to find what are the capabilities that we can pull out, that sort of the team that's building this application needs this thing, but that actually we're like, man, this other thing over there also needs that.
Yeah.
And we're like, and oh my gosh, like actually it's not like blocking sales for the other applications in Rippling other than those two, but like it would really differentiate the product because no one has this in those cases and it would be useful. And so how do we take that, yank it down into the platform layer, build as a platform capability, but then also just like go like 10 times deeper, and build it in a way more robust fashion and make it much more configurable, cover all of the use cases, all the sort of, all the things that people need. And you get this benefit that actually my COO calls going abroad, which is like, by building these things centrally, they need to accommodate sort of like critical use cases across a lot of different product lines. And what that does is it forces you, it actually makes them way better for every single one. Because you end up finding these use cases that are critical for one product that end up not being critical for another one, but actually like really nice to have and sort of incredibly useful if you're going to build them. Sort of like the way that, one of the things that I think you get when you travel is that you sort of see all the things that are like slightly different, but maybe like a little bit similar, but not quite in terms of how things work in that country. And it gives you this new understanding and appreciation of like how things might work or fit together. And so we end up doing that across a lot of different product areas, which I think reinforces product quality like across all of them.
Love it. I think there's another benefit in that like people are actually all in the same system, I guess, compared to like people being in 3 different systems, people not having the empathy for the other side. Actually, a lot of this also has nice parallels to how we think about building in Notion, right? Which is actually having a single system for doing a lot of the knowledge work that you do has some amazing benefits.
And everything's interoperable. Everything seamlessly works together. And I think, for a long time, the conventional wisdom in SaaS has been that you want these like narrow point solutions. And I think we've been building software wrong for 20 years. And it's sort of like if you bought a car and instead of buying a car, you bought like a carburetor from one manufacturer and steering wheel from the other, and like a chassis and some seats from a third and fourth. And then you took it home and like assembled it in your garage and like sort of wrapped it up in duct tape and like then started trying to drive it down the street. And like of course it would be terrible. Like of course things would be sort of falling off as you're going down the road. But like that's how companies buy software for the most part today.
Going back, I guess, can you talk a little bit about your first customer? How did you find them? What did you tell them? How did you sell them Rippling?
Man, I'm trying to remember who was the actual first customer at Rippling. What we did is, so we went through YC, and there was a certain point where we just needed a bunch of people to kind of like, a bunch of companies so we could start paying people and payroll and pressure testing the system. And so we did this deal with companies in our batch where we said, look, we need a bunch of people really quickly. Anyone that signs up and runs payroll with us in the next 2 weeks, Rippling will be like free for you forever. And there were a bunch of companies that signed up, and some of them went on to be like quite substantial.
Maybe related, can you talk a little bit about maybe like the first customer who churned? Like how did you sort of like think about that? What did it change in terms of how you build the product and roadmap? And I say this as like, entrepreneurs are going to go through that, and like how should they think about it?
Of course. I don't remember exactly like who the first customer that churned was, but and I don't remember like exactly what the reason was. But certainly like like what I found is that most of the churn that we've had as a company has been about sort of missing things, like gaps in the product. And in a weird way, it sort of reinforces the central value prop. Like, when we lose customers, other than if we screw up, which, hopefully doesn't happen a lot, but we're not like immune from that. It tends to be because there's like a module that someone needs, or like a critical capability that they don't have. And so like, to me, it's like, well, it needs to be like more all in one. There's stuff that's missing from the bundle. So early on, the clearest thing that we had like that was actually benefits. So I started Rippling, my previous company had been very focused on benefits and was just like had so much scar tissue from that. I incorrectly said, we're not going to touch benefits at Rippling. So we did, I eventually came around, and actually my team really convinced me of this because I was like the last one to be convinced of this. And two of our early employees, actually this guy named Ashwin and this guy named Sriram, took this on and really built it and made it happen. And it was like a huge like overnight sea change for the company. Like once we got all that in place, that was when things really started to take off because it closed this like critical gap. Today, we have actually something very similar for a different set of companies, which is scheduling. And so it is like one of the biggest like internal R&D efforts for us right now is like building that product. And I think very much in Rippling fashion, when we build it, we don't view it as like, okay, well, what do we need to do to like close the gap and like staunch the bleeding and like, like make this go away. Instead, what we're trying to do, and it's taking a little bit longer, is we're trying to look at what are the most difficult scheduling cases out there that really just push the limits of all of these systems.
Yeah.
And like I think that like that, what it does is it like the easy way would be to take the approach of like, well, it's like the all-in-one product, like, you're not going to get like all the features and you inevitably it fails because like you really the compound thing only works if you're forcing yourself to be as good and to find a way to beat the point solution products at their own game. And like and like whether that, and that's often by winning on a lot of the platform capabilities, finding ways to do things in the platform layer instead of in the application layer, or just forcing yourself to like really go all the way in the application layer and like get the data model right. But it's often in like finding those extreme cases that you sort of reveal to yourself like what is the actual data model for this system? What's the right data model to kind of get this right and like nail it? And so that's sort of like how we sort of think about building products.
Actually, one related question to this is like at this point, like how do you think about sequencing the features, right? Because you probably have all these different set of customers, different needs. I think when you're building a compound startup, you probably could go like 10, 20 different directions, right? So is there a formula that you all use as a way to sort of think about like, this is the thing we build next and then this thing follows after that?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. One is like, what are the things, like we look a lot at like, why do we lose and why do customers churn? And like that gap analysis is like very revealing that we need to like, so that would be like a big reason why we're building scheduling, for example. The other one is, the other thing that we look at is, I think that, compound startups in general, whether it's Rippling or other businesses, they have 5 specific advantages over point solution competitors. And those advantages are first, that the products are much more deeply integrated with each other.
Yeah.
Second, that the products are much more integrated with some underlying sort of data set. In our case, like the employee graph, but it might be something else in other systems. And that unlocks a lot of product capability. Like there are usually new features or product capabilities that arise as a result of that. The third, which is I think the most critical, is this ability to build like at the platform layer where you can abstract out some things that are repeated across products and build it much better. And so you can win on sort of your platform capabilities. The fourth is that you can preserve a common UX. So like things, someone knows how to use one of your products, they immediately probably know how to use one of the others. Like a lot of the UX is conserved, or sort of immediately familiar with it. And lastly, there are sort of pricing and contracting advantages that you have because you can amortize sales and marketing, R&D costs, things like that over multiple SKUs instead of having to like bake it all into like one of them. And so those are the 5 things. Those are the 5 ways that you win. And so I think you want to look at verticals where those 5 things tend to be maximized and do them roughly in the order that they are maximized. And so you want to look for product areas where integration with your other products matters, where integration with the underlying source of truth in your system, unlocks a lot of product capability, where the middleware capabilities, the platform layer, things like analytics and role-based permissions and workflow automations, the specific ones that you've invested in matter in that new product area and are going to allow you to build a better product as a result of that than sort of your point SaaS competitors. You want products with this, all else being equal, the same buyer or an existing buyer in your system, because that's conserved UX doesn't matter if it's a completely different person. And all else being equal, you want products where there's an opportunity to sort of play games with pricing, to sort of win on a pricing perspective with the bundle, vis-a-vis like point solution competitors. And so that's the other thing. I mean, those set of things are the things that we look at.
All right. So just closing it out, maybe 2 quick questions. First one, describe a day in the life of Parker Conrad. How do you start your day? Like, do you have any rituals, customs that keep you going?
So normally I start out, so I've got to get my kids out of bed, which usually is like a chore, because they tend to stay up too late, and so it's hard to get them out of bed.
Same in my household.
Yeah, so like I make coffee and then I take them to school. So we have one of those utility bikes with the kids on the back, and my sort of the way my wife and I divide stuff up, like I do school drop off, usually. So I take them to school about 8 o'clock, and then come back and head into work. At work, I try and keep meetings like, pretty light. Like I don't do well when like my calendar gets blocked up with meetings. Like, but I have like a lot of stuff that I do that ends up, work stuff that ends up filling out the rest of the time. Like some of it is like, stuff on Slack. A lot of it ends up being sort of like being the Rippling admin. So like, I've got, a bunch of bills I got to go pay after this, and expense reports to approve and payroll to run and like that kind of stuff. So that actually takes up a decent amount of time, but it actually takes up more time for me because I'm always doing it as a product exercise. So I spend a little bit of time doing it and a little bit of time going to the individual product and engineering teams and sort of, either complaining about things or suggesting changes or, trying to get things like, reformed around the way I'm using the product. And then, I usually leave, go home around 7 o'clock. I'm in the office 5 days a week. I hate working at home. Just really, really dislike it. And so then I'm come home around 7 o'clock. Usually either I do all the cooking in our household too. So my wife does a lot of stuff, but the things I handle are kid drop off and cooking. And so then, usually either cook dinner, sometimes order DoorDash, say goodnight to the kids, and then I'm usually in bed pretty early. So I don't know.
Oh. I hope my wife is not watching this because I did not cook after a long day.
You probably do other things though.
I do other things, yeah. Okay, last question. If you were to write a book about what's gotten to this point of your career, what would you title it?
That's interesting. Maybe like amplitude. I think that like my career has had, I've just had some like really big highs and some really big lows. And so I just sometimes feel like just the sort of the sinusoidal curve is like much, seems to have like much bigger swings or has had much bigger swings for me. Really starting, very early on in high school, college, and then obviously like since then, I've famously I've had a lot of both really big professional successes and really sort of deep and awful professional failures as well. And so there's been a lot of that sort of like up and down for me in my career.
Well, Parker, thank you for joining us today. Lots of amazing insights.
Cool. Thanks a bunch.
First Block is brought to you by Notion for Startups. We at Notion care deeply about startups and founders, and we hope these stories inspire you to keep building. To learn more about how we are supporting startups, please visit notion.com/startups.